It's a quiet December night in the heart of the Philippines. The sea is calm, the air heavy with humidity, and thousands of families are heading home for the holidays. Among them, the passenger ferry MV Doña Paz glides steadily through the dark waters of the Tablas Strait, its decks lit by weak yellow lamps and the sound of chatter echoing from crowded corridors. No one on board knows that within hours, the ship will vanish in a fire so intense that rescuers will find little more than twisted metal and oil on the water's surface. It will become the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, a tragedy so vast that even decades later, the true number of victims remains uncertain. The Doña Paz was a 2,215-ton passenger ferry built in Japan in 1963 and later sold to the Sulpicio Lines Company in the Philippines. She ran the busy route between Tacloban City on Leyte Island and the capital, Manila, a voyage of roughly 420 nautical miles across the Sibuyan Sea. Officially, the ship was allowed to carry just over 1,400 passengers, but on December 20, 1987, more than 4,000 people are believed to have boarded, many without tickets, crowding into stairwells, corridors, and even the open decks. It was just days before Christmas, and demand for passage home was overwhelming. By 10 p.m., the ferry was halfway through its journey. The seas were calm, and a faint moon shimmered on the water. Most passengers slept on makeshift bedding or cardboard sheets laid out wherever space allowed. In the crew's quarters, a skeleton team kept watch on the bridge, confident that the night would remain uneventful. But hundreds of miles away, an oil tanker named MT Vector was moving through the same stretch of sea. It carried over 8,000 barrels of gasoline and petroleum products bound for Manila. The tanker's navigation lights were dim, and according to later testimony, the crew may have been unlicensed and inadequately trained. Shortly before 11:30 p.m., the two ships found themselves on a collision course. On the bridge of the Doña Paz, the crew saw distant lights but assumed they belonged to a vessel traveling safely on the opposite heading. The tanker's crew, distracted and under-equipped, failed to maintain a proper lookout. At 10:30 p.m., passengers on the ferry's upper decks began noticing a faint light on the horizon that seemed to grow brighter. Moments later, the sea erupted in a blinding flash. The MT Vector slammed into the Doña Paz's port side. In an instant, gasoline barrels exploded, sending a wall of fire racing across the water. The force shattered windows and ignited the ship's paint and fuel lines. The decks turned into corridors of flame. Panic spread instantly. Thousands of passengers were trapped below deck, many sleeping in cabins with sealed windows and narrow exits. Those who managed to reach the upper decks faced an inferno of burning oil spreading across the surface of the sea. The heat was so intense that lifeboats melted before they could be lowered. Survivors later recalled hearing a deafening roar followed by screams and the smell of burning fuel. Within minutes, the Doña Paz was engulfed from bow to stern. Flames reached over 30 meters high, visible from nearby islands. The ferry's electrical systems failed almost immediately. No Mayday signal was ever sent. In the chaos, passengers jumped overboard to escape the flames, only to find themselves trapped in burning water, coated with gasoline from the ruptured tanker. Some tried to cling to debris, others swam blindly through smoke and darkness. Within 20 minutes, the Doña Paz was fully ablaze. Witnesses from distant shorelines described the horizon glowing red, as if the sea itself were on fire. The MT Vector, still carrying massive amounts of fuel, also burned uncontrollably. Most of its crew perished within minutes of the impact. The two vessels drifted together, locked in a deadly embrace, until both sank into the deep. Of the estimated 4,386 people on board the Doña Paz, only 24 survived. They would later tell of leaping from the ferry as the decks collapsed, swimming through burning oil for hours before being rescued by passing vessels the next morning. Many suffered severe burns and shock. At dawn, the Philippine Coast Guard reached the site. All they found was a vast slick of fuel, charred wreckage, and bodies floating across the waves. The surface of the Tablas Strait was littered with ash, clothing, and fragments of the once massive ferry. The smell of smoke and diesel lingered for days. As news broke, disbelief turned to outrage. Families gathered at the Manila port searching for loved ones who would never return. Government officials initially listed just 1,500 casualties, but as evidence of overcrowding mounted, the numbers soared beyond 4,000. It was a tragedy magnified not only by human error but by neglect, corruption, and indifference. A disaster that might have been avoided had basic safety standards been enforced. And yet the story of the Doña Paz was far from over. In the weeks that followed, investigators would uncover details about the ship's condition, its missing safety equipment, and the mystery surrounding why no distress call was ever heard. The answers would reveal a chain of failures so severe that it would shock the entire maritime world. When daylight broke over the Tabla Strait, a thin mist hung above the sea. Beneath it, all that remained of the Doña Paz and MT Vector was a slick of oil, twisted metal, and silence. For hours, small fishing boats searched the wreckage. They found burned life vests, children's clothes, and the faint smell of smoke drifting across the water. No one could believe that almost an entire ship had vanished overnight. The Philippine Coast Guard arrived later that morning, but by then the fires had burned out and the survivors were few. 24 people had lived through the night, 19 from the ferry and 5 from the tanker. Many were found floating in the debris, clinging to wooden planks, their skin blackened from fuel burns. They told rescuers the same story. There were no alarms, no lifeboats, no crew orders, only fire. In Manila, the news spread rapidly. At first, officials believed it was a small collision, perhaps a few hundred casualties. But as lists of missing passengers grew, the horrifying scale began to surface. The ferry's manifest showed just over 1,400 names, yet witnesses insisted that the decks had been packed wall to wall. Families demanded answers, and soon the truth emerged. The Doña Paz had been carrying nearly 3 times her legal capacity. The first investigation revealed an appalling lack of safety. Most of the ship's life jackets were locked in storage rooms. Several lifeboats were missing or unusable. Even more shocking, the radio equipment was not functioning. The vessel's radio operator had reportedly left his post to watch television when the collision occurred. This meant that when the tanker struck, no distress call ever went out. Nearby ships sailing within visual range didn't realize a disaster was unfolding until hours later. On the other side of the investigation, the MT Vector was found to be just as unfit for sea. Its crew had no valid licenses, its safety systems were in disrepair, and its navigation lights may not have been working that night. Investigators confirmed that the ship's owner had not renewed its operating certificate, meaning the tanker should never have been at sea at all. It was, in every sense, a collision waiting to happen. As details became public, the Philippine press labeled it Asia's Titanic. The comparison fit all too well. Both ships overcrowded, both safety failures ignored, both stories marked by official denial and public grief. For days, the port of Manila was flooded with relatives carrying photographs, praying that a name might appear on the short list of survivors. The reality was devastating. Over 4,300 dead, including entire families. The government ordered a formal inquiry led by the Board of Marine Inquiry. The findings were damning. The MT Vector's owner was found criminally liable for operating an unseaworthy vessel, while the Sulpicio Lines Company, which owned the Doña Paz, was accused of negligence for overcrowding and poor maintenance. Maritime safety enforcement agencies were criticized for allowing both ships to operate unchecked. But despite public outrage, no one faced serious criminal charges. Compensation for victims' families was minimal. Some received the equivalent of just a few hundred US dollars. Over the following years, the Doña Paz disaster triggered gradual reforms in Philippine maritime law, including stricter capacity limits and vessel inspections. Yet corruption and lax enforcement continued, leading to later accidents involving the same ferry company. For survivors, however, the reforms meant little. They carried memories no regulation could erase, the faces of family members disappearing into fire, the sound of the sea boiling with fuel, the feeling of swimming through burning water while the night sky turned red. The wrecks of both vessels were never recovered. They rest in a deep section of the Tabla Strait, entombed in oil-soaked sediment. Local fishermen still avoid the area, calling it the Sea of Ghosts. On each anniversary, relatives gather at a seaside monument in Balogan City. Names etched in stone fade under sun and rain, yet candles still flicker beside them. The ocean beyond remains deceptively calm, the same calm that fooled thousands that December night. Nearly 4 decades later, the Doña Paz remains the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster ever recorded. Not caused by a storm or war, but by greed, negligence, and silence. It's a story that still echoes across the Philippines, a reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedies aren't acts of nature, but of human failure.